Welcome to Gabby, the Marriage and Family podcast, where it will be okay. We are your hosts, marriage counselors Terrell and Tanisha Pugh. We are a family of 9 who, after the death of our daughter, learned that life was going to be okay. And now, we help other families in distress realize the same. Are you ready to heal and learn that your marriage and family will be okay? Well, let's get started. Hello, this is Terrell Pugh, and thank you so much for listening to the Gabby podcast. How would you like to do what you love, working with couples as a marriage coach or with individuals and families as a Christian counselor? Well, we can help you over at tntpugh.com. That's tntpew.com. Hey, we'd love to help you get started today, again, working as a marriage coach or a Christian counselor. Head over to tntpew.com. Thank you.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gabby podcast from Marriage and Family. I'm your host, Tanisha Pugh, and this is
Terrell Pugh, your other host.
All right. In this episode, we'll be talking about trauma. We'll talk about trauma in marriage. I don't know that many people realize that couples can experience, or individuals in marital relationships or marital setting can experience trauma.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we attribute trauma with very specific situations, and that does not include marriage. So we're going to talk about that tonight.
And I'm excited because it's a much needed topic. We'll talk about a little of trauma in family, also what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And so as we talk about that, we'll really be talking about what trauma looks like, maybe in individuals and children, and then, of course, how that may come out in a marital system or family system, and what signs to look for yourself if you're seeing that in your dynamics, and then, of course, to seek help. But like you said, most people attribute trauma to like war.
Yeah.
Right?
Car accidents. Mm-hmm. And which those things are traumatic.
Those
indeed.
are traumatic. They are. I'll say, but it's a lot more broader than that.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Mm-hmm. And I think it may just be not having a full understanding of what trauma is.
Yeah.
So what is trauma?
Well, actually, I was going to have you answer that.
Well, I will say that trauma can be defined as a sudden, unexpected impact to your equilibrium, to what you perceive to be normal. A traumatic event is something that can really knock you off your center. That's the event. The trauma is how you respond, or the aftermath once that event has occurred. Right?
Yes.
So it's your brain's response and how it's processing whatever that traumatic event is. So I think I started out by saying how trauma happens versus what trauma is.
No, that's good, because I think you bring up a good point to make. Trauma isn't always necessarily the event. Right? The event is the event.
Correct.
Whereas the trauma is your response to the event. Right? So, for example, we'll take war or car crash. So the car crash or the war is not the trauma.
Right.
It's how you respond, or your responses, that makes that trauma. So I think that's good. And yeah, absolutely. Any situation that throws you off your equilibrium, any situation that catches you off guard, that's unexpected, that's outside of what you perceive should be happening, and begins to overwhelm you, right? So that's another feature, that it overwhelms you. And so once that happens, your brain is unable to process and cope. And individuals have very different traumatic responses, which is why there's also different treatments for trauma that we'll get into a little later, because there is no one size fits all with trauma.
That's right, because everyone respond to what would be what is trauma, or everyone responds differently to traumatic events.
Yeah.
For example,
Well, can I?
Sure, yes,
So
please.
if you can sort of tell our audience, so in a marriage and in a family, what are some traumatic things
That can
that
happen.
can happen in a marriage or a family?
All right. Yes. In a marriage, the big one is infidelity. Infidelity can be quite traumatic. And truly, it could be traumatic to what we identify as the participating spouse, who would be the person who committed the infidelity. And it also, and that may not be something one would consider, is, well, if they're the cheater, why would they be traumatized? But we'll talk about that a little bit. And of course, the
Injured
injured
spouse.
spouse as well would suffer trauma from that.
So,
Another.
so really quickly, so you mean to tell me that cheating, right, infidelity has the same type of traumatic impact that, say, someone who has gone to war has?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, we're not solely looking at the event. We're looking
That's
at,
right.
here is something that is unexpected. You felt where you once felt safety, where you once were able to predict what would come next. All of a sudden, you're unable to do that. All of a sudden, nothing makes sense. All of a sudden, here's this unexpected thing that just kind of shift your outlook.
Right.
And that is what trauma is. That's what's traumatic,
Yeah.
right? That's
Now let me ask you this: is this sexual infidelity? Is this, someone was just texting someone? Does it matter?
It really doesn't. It's specific to how an individual would respond to whatever is happening.
That's right.
So where one person may be more traumatized by sexual infidelity, another person could be more traumatized by the fact that their spouse has opened up and connected emotionally with someone else.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit because that's a big one. That's a
That
big
is.
area.
We may need another podcast episode to talk about that, right?
Yeah.
Infidelity. I think we'll do that.
Indeed.
But the reason why I'm asking these questions is because I want to point out that, again, the trauma isn't necessarily the situation, but the
Right.
response.
That's right.
So whether it's cheating by way of, a sexual interaction or, text messages and emotional connection, that spouse, the injured spouse, can be traumatized.
That's right.
And then
That's right.
experience or exhibit some of those symptoms of trauma.
Yeah. It really comes down to, how am I processing this new information that I wasn't expecting, that caught me off guard?
Yeah.
It's like a punch in the gut when you weren't expecting it.
Yeah.
It throws you off. Another traumatic event, or that can happen in marriages or in a family, is when you experience financial trouble.
Yes, that's true.
Significant financial loss. And I say significant, but that's of course relative.
That is, yeah.
Right? But when people go through loss of their home, right, loss of a job, they can indeed, that can be a traumatic occurrence. And I can speak to that from first person experience. When we went through our transition, we didn't necessarily lose our home, but we lost what I considered to be stable and secure income.
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, and we did go into foreclosure.
That's right.
And that was traumatic.
Yes, it was.
That was traumatic again.
Yes, it was.
And I'll say this, to even go beyond what we're saying here, although we're speaking in the context of a family and of a marriage, that financial trauma, there's also poverty trauma, right? Trauma that's experienced as a result of poverty.
That's right.
And I don't know if that's what you were going to mention
It
with
is.
regards to, your background, but yeah.
It absolutely is. A lot of times, we encounter individuals, and it's so funny how being in this field where you talk to people and they're reporting certain symptoms or of what they're seeing as they're doing life, and you start to really reflect and say, aha. It's like you get a light bulb moment when you recognize that, oh my goodness, I think I know what you're dealing with. I think I know what's at the root. But people who migrate from countries, I wouldn't necessarily say third world countries, but a lot of times from the Caribbean, we'll say. Yeah. I'm a migrant of Jamaica. Yeah. And in Jamaica, there were nights I went to sleep and didn't have food. Didn't happen very often, thank God. But there is one particular night that I can distinctly remember going to bed without food. And that was that, as a child, I remember thinking, well, this is different. This is interesting. Where's my food? Maybe tomorrow I'll get some. But you don't realize what that's doing to your brain. Right. And when I had an opportunity to migrate here to America, I remember there being times where I'm in a house. Here I am in a house with my father, my stepmom, and my half sister and half brothers. And when I got food, I wanted to put my food away and hide it so that I can get back to it and have, something to eat.
Yeah. And that was a behavior of the trauma.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. Okay, so let's talk about another instance or type of trauma that families can experience, unless you wanted to stay here a little while.
No, that's good. That's good. There is the, and I'm sorry, excuse me for mumbling over my words.
You're fine. You didn't mumble at all.
But yes, so there's the financial trauma that families can experience. Trauma. There's infidelity.
That's right.
And I wanted to sort of maybe just lump a lot of that, just loss of possessions in that financial trauma, because that can cause a cascade of trauma.
That's right.
Right?
That's
Whether
right.
it's the loss of the house and then you respond in a particular way, if you go into foreclosure, or if you're in an apartment and you get evicted, right? So homelessness also will elicit a traumatic response.
Absolutely. That's absolutely it will.
Yeah. And I will also say, and a lot of individuals may not be thinking about this, but when families move from one location to another location, and if they're not well adjusted to their new location, that transition in and of itself can be traumatic.
That's right.
It's a traumatic transition. It's a traumatic change. And then the children may experience and exhibit adjustment behaviors where they're having difficulty adjusting to friends or even within the home.
Yeah.
And then, of course, parents, adults can also experience that as well.
Indeed.
Where they have those adjustment problems.
Yeah. Because we don't recognize, for different people, we rely on a certain amount of social support. And when there's a sudden change to that without preparing in our minds for what that journey is going to look like when we are in it, and again, sudden, right? Yes, you may be planning to move. You want to move out of state, but you've not truly sat down and considered, I'm going to have to make a brand new social circle. I'm going to have to build a whole new social support system, especially if you don't have family or friends in that location. And we've seen this happen, and it can lead to a state of depression for some people.
It can.
Yeah.
It can.
So,
and really quickly, I'll say this: trauma is a lot more common than people realize. Trauma is very common. Again, it's not just limited to isolated events like war or car accidents and things like this. It can literally be anything that you experience here in life that you were simply unprepared for. It catches you off guard, throws you off your equilibrium, and overwhelms you.
Yes.
And that can be a number of things.
Yeah, and it's important that you list out all of those things, because those do have to be present for it to be trauma.
Absolutely.
And I'll say this too, and again, I can speak to this because of my background, and maybe actually, quite frankly, the entire African American community. I don't think that we take enough time to recognize the impact that trauma can have on us and
Yes.
on how we interact, on how we progress, on how we apply ourselves in the workplace. If we don't take the time to recognize that impact, that can really be an inhibitor from us being able to move forward healthily in relationships. And I say that because in the Caribbean, we don't talk about trauma. We didn't mention sexual abuse or molestation or incest. Those things are very traumatic for people. It's traumatic for if you were abused as a child, and we can talk about some of the ways that can play out in your life as an adult. There are many ways that we experience trauma.
Absolutely. And while we're here on the topic of, not necessarily here on the topic, but mentioning children, I will say this, some signs of trauma in children tend to be anger. If the child is angry, it could be regression, where the child goes back to a prior stage. If the prior stage was bedwetting, it can be bedwetting. If the prior stage was not sharing, if the prior stage was not being as social, so the child can become more nonverbal, more reclusive. So any type of regression. Also difficulty sleeping, nightmares, becoming a picky eater.
Isolating.
That's
no
right.
Longer wanting
Isolating.
to socialize.
That's right. That's right. In older children that are maybe adolescents, it could be sexual activity. If the child is sexually active, they can see an increase of sexual promiscuity. If they're not, they can begin early in promiscuity. We also see that trauma sometimes impacts young females by bringing up the onset of their menstrual cycle earlier than it would have normally have happened.
That's right.
And so that's an example of how trauma can actually physically change your body.
And to speak to that just a little bit more, the onset of young women's menstrual, I also think it's interesting. There was a study done where researchers found that when young girls are either parentified or perhaps their fathers aren't present.
Yes, have the absentee father.
Absentee father. So even if dad is in the home, but he's just not a protector, maybe he's just not present.
Yes.
That something happens in these young girls that cause their bodies to respond in kind of a fight or flight. So your autonomic nervous system, right?
Yes.
And it makes them feel that, you know what, I have to protect myself. I have to grow up, and that kind of catapult them into early puberty.
That's very true.
That study was quite enlightening. I think that you might have shared that with me.
Yeah, some years ago.
Have I missed anything from that?
No, that's good. That's good. That's it. Yeah, that's it.
And I thought that was so intriguing. So even being an absentee father can result in that being trauma on your daughter.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
When I came across that information, it made sense.
Yeah.
It made sense, but it's not something we think about.
It's not.
So fathers, if you have young girls, you need to spend time with them. You need to father them. You need to make them feel safe.
Yes.
You need to hug them. You need to love them. You need to be present.
Yes. And if you're not, I'm going to come for you.
That's right. And I'll be right behind him.
I'm not Liam Neeson, right? But I do have a particular set of skills.
Yes,
They're
he
counseling
does.
skills.
Hallelujah. And I'll pray. That's
pray. That's right. No, but that is serious. Fathers do need to be present in the home.
Yes.
And one thing our society is doing, they're and this is nothing necessarily new in modern society, but fathers don't get enough encouragement to be present. And looking at all the research, of the absence of a father, it just is not psychologically sound for something like that to happen, because of what you just shared, what we just shared there.
Yeah.
But that's another topic in and of itself.
Yes.
One last thing I wanted to mention with trauma in children,
Yes.
you also see that there's an increase in talking about safety or their fear. So what will happen is your child may begin to just be very cautious and be very safe. So, for example, if it's a car accident, they're going to want everyone in the car to put their seatbelts on. They're going to want to make sure that you do everything by the book, that you're looking in your mirrors if they're that aware, of course.
Yeah.
But relative to the situation, that you will see an increase in their preoccupation concerning their safety,
Yes.
and then also them exhibiting fear.
Yes, and if you remember, so maybe 3 summers ago, it might have been, we were planning a road trip. We're getting ready to go on a road trip with my sister-in-law, their family, and our family, and we were hit by a drunk driver. The vehicle that was behind us was my sister-in-law, and the drunk driver struck her vehicle, which then struck ours, which was in the front. And I do recall our youngest, who was at the time maybe 7 or 8.
7 or 8.
Yes, I remember for her, she would say things like, when we got a replacement conversion van, which is a bigger van, sits very high, she would say, I don't want to drive in the car. Let's drive in the bigger van, because if we drive in the bigger van, we won't get hurt if someone hits us. Or she would say, she would just make different observation as we're driving on the highway. And that was so hard to hear, because I knew what was going on.
Yes.
And with that, when you see signs of trauma, and Terrell gave some great examples of some signs of trauma in children, particularly, you don't want to ignore it. You also don't want to act overly excited, if that makes sense,
Right.
Because that can just reinforce their fears.
Yes.
So you want to acknowledge it, and then you want to gently and just in a nurturing way kind of give them new information.
Yes.
About what it is their fears are.
That's right. So it's a healthy balance of dialogue and then also redirecting.
Yes.
A big key in trauma, becoming trauma, is the rumination of whatever has happened.
Yeah.
And so if you're consistently talking and talking and talking about it, you're more likely to develop trauma, right? But if you're talking about it in a healthy way, and there's really no way to determine how much talk is healthy, but there is an obvious way to determine how much is too much rumination, right? When it becomes an all of the time conversation. But if you're dealing with children, yes, you talk about it in a very normal, natural setting, while also redirecting a lot of their fears in a rational way.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And then you do the same thing for yourself as well, as you engage in conversations with yourself, the self-talk, or with friends or family. And this is why counseling is so important as well at a traumatic event, because it helps you talk through and not get stuck in cyclical dialogue with yourself that's negative.
Right. That's right. That keeps you trapped. And that's a healthy way to grow from, or heal. I won't say grow, but heal, although that could be a form of growth from trauma.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the infidelity piece.
Infidelity?
Right?
Well, only because of the time. I know we don't have time to get into that.
Sure.
Let's move into some treatments, right? How do you treat trauma? How do you deal with trauma? What are the treatments that are available for trauma? We just talked about one, which is something everyone can do at a traumatic response, or traumatic event. They can start changing the way they talk about it, right?
Absolutely.
But some other sort of more official treatments?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about, mindfulness, but that is research-based
Yes.
intervention that's proven to work for individuals who suffer trauma. Talk therapy.
Yeah. And before you move away from the mindfulness, I'm going to throw in there yoga as well as meditation. Those are two research-based activities that also are really effective with trauma. And that's because what happens is when you experience a traumatic event, the saying trauma gets trapped in your body. When you engage, in yoga, and think of yoga as, you're engaging your body in stretching and breathing. And the traumatic response usually is to not breathe or to have, what's the word? When your breathing is erratic or
no, that's good.
Getting jumbled here.
That's good.
But where you're irregular, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Your breathing becomes irregular. And so through yoga and meditation, they essentially teach you how to breathe. And what that does is it teaches you how to calm yourself down, how to allow more oxygen to your brain so you can think more clearly and more rationally. And it allows you out of that cyclical negative thinking. When we talk about the yoga with the stretching, a lot of individuals, when they do experience trauma, they get tense in their body, in their necks, in their shoulders, in their chest areas. They feel queasiness or unsettling of their stomach. Sometimes even legs. Individuals start to feel as if their limbs are heavy, believe it or not. And that's an actual condition where your limbs feel heavy, which also inflicts individuals who suffer with depression.
Impacts.
Right. But if you are practicing stretching and movement, you're able to gain more control over those things and come out of that traumatic response. But just wanted to add that before we moved away from that.
That's great. That's great. It makes me think of, in the context of Christian counseling, talk therapy is also very good, but also if you are a clinician and are certified, you can also walk your clients through cognitive therapy with mindfulness.
Yes.
So that if you couple the two together, that's wonderful. And then as a Christian counselor, when someone has suffered trauma, because their worldview has been disrupted in some way, it's tethering them back to their faith, to what grounds them, is also a very impactful way to move someone from that place of trauma where they're healed, because they're reintroduced again to something that's familiar. And especially because we know that our God is alive and well. Any space you invite him into, he can absolutely heal you. And so that's why I love how we practice at Arise and Live Christian Counseling. We don't see healing as separate from the Word of God or the Spirit of God.
Right. Your relationship with your Creator, with God.
That's right.
And I want to say this to that. At the heart of all these treatments, maybe not all the treatments, but majority of trauma treatments, is the key element of learning how to love yourself. And so when you're connecting yourself to God, that's what you do. You learn how to love yourself.
Love yourself well.
And love yourself well, because what happens with trauma, you typically tell yourself, I could have done something differently. Why did I do this? You place yourself in this place of blame, and you experience a lot of guilt as a result of that. Even if it's childhood sexual trauma, you sometimes say, well, it's my fault.
That's right.
So helping you to understand how to love yourself well, that is going to be at the heart and the center of trauma treatment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You reminded me, I think it's Matthew 39, and if I'm getting it wrong, forgive me, it is in Matthew. This may be an opportunity for you to go through all of Matthew.
Right.
But where Jesus was being provoked or challenged by the the C's, Sadducees, Pharisees,
Yes.
they were asking him which is the greatest commandment,
Commandment. Hmm.
to challenge him. And Jesus said the first, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yes.
And I'll never forget. I'm sure others have had this revelation before, but I had it first time when I read that scripture, which I read 1,000,001 times. Love others as you love yourself. So that peace that you speak of when you said love yourself well,
Yes.
it's true. Loving yourself well is recognizing and realizing that, you know what, everything that you might have done in any given situation that you were in, you did with what knowledge you had in that moment.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And just as you are to extend grace to your neighbor, you have to extend grace to yourself. And sometimes we don't practice that. We don't do that. And so love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yeah.
Be kind to yourself. Be forgiving to yourself.
Yes.
Extend grace.
Amen. Amen. And yeah, I won't add anything to that. That's absolutely.
Yes. So to be continued, because I want us to. Yes.
I'll quickly mention
Sure.
two last treatments here,
Yes.
because we may not get to do this version of the podcast again, this topic as well. EMDR. Okay. Well, I said I was going to mention. I was going to turn it over to you to talk about it. But EMDR, that's a treatment. You can go to a certified counselor who does know how to do EMDR, and that is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And all that simply is, that sounds very complicated. The science behind that is not we don't know why it works completely yet. There's a lot of theories as to why it works.
Okay.
But essentially what it is it the clinician will have you recall the memory so that it's at the forefront of your mind. And then what they will do is they'll place an object, their finger or a pen or something, in front of your line of sight and begin to move it very quickly. Very quickly. If you're looking at this on YouTube, it's just like this. And if you're listening to me, I hope you can sort of visualize what I'm saying. But what happens is when you have that image in your mind, of that traumatic image, the thought is that as you are focusing on something else, that your brain is in the process of processing that new information quickly because it's moving.
Desensitizing you to the intense
and
impact of the trauma.
Exactly.
Yes.
And desensitizing you to the trauma.
Yes.
And then one last treatment here that I'll mention is theater therapy.
Yes, theater therapy.
Theater therapy is essentially when you engage in taking on of roles. So, for example, you can take on the role of a superhero because maybe in a traumatic event you were a victim, right, or a survivor, but now you're a superhero, and through that you're able to gain a new perspective, gain new skills, and feel what it feels like to actually exist as the hero in the event.
Yes, yes.
But in any event, looks like we have to go because our time clock is running.
Yes. But this was a really great topic, and I hope we do get back to it.
Yes, absolutely.
But thank you all for listening. And again, I'm Tanisha Pugh.
And I'm Terrell.
Have a great night. It will be okay.
It will be okay.
Hello, this is Terrell Pugh, and thank you so much for listening to the Gabby podcast. How would you like to do what you love, working with couples as a marriage coach or with individuals and families as a Christian counselor? Well, we can help you over at tntpugh.com. That's tntpugh.com. Hey, we'd love to help you get started today, again, working as a marriage coach or a Christian counselor. Head over to tntpugh.com. Thank you.